Hey guys, what's up? So, how are fantasy novels the same as philosophy? Or how is philosophy related to fantasy novels? So, it's of course like a fantasy novel is a made up story. Basically, it's sort of like a lot of the time it's the experience of the author or the life of the author, kind of like in a metaphor form in his story. So whatever's happening in the author's life is happening like inside the story in some way. And that's how authors like find out ways, find out like what kind of story to tell. Because the things that are happening in their life happen in the story. So the thing about fantasy stories is that they're basically all, yes, they're imaginary and made up, but they're only partly imaginary and made up. Most of it is people. People are people inside whatever like genre, whatever place you put them. It's about how will people be inside this kind of scenario or this kind of environment. Like you might have a modern story, just a story of fiction, where you're talking about people, but they're people in a modern life setting. When you have a fantasy setting, it's people, but they would do different things and react in a different way and have different relationships and have different personalities and just lead different lives if they were inside a fantasy universe. And philosophy goes into it because it represents whatever philosophy the author is thinking at the time. So that has to do with fantasy, and it has to do with science fiction also. Science fiction is about the future and where this world is going and where will it be in the future. Fantasy is basically, a lot of times, it's medieval fantasy or otherworldly fantasy where it's more or less the past with dragons and magic and wizards and kings and knights and quests and magic items and things like that, right? And in science fiction, it's about like where will this world be in the future. It's either a utopian story where the world is a better place in the future, and they explain why. What is the technology and what is like the social structures and the political structures and how people are in the future that make the world that better place. Or it's a warning that the world can become a worse place, like in in the novel 1984, which at the time was the future, but it was a warning about giving the government too much power and having like cameras everywhere, and people all looking the same and acting the same. And if somebody is different, then they're kind of singled out and said there's something, and they are blamed as something is wrong with them and stuff. I mean, 1984 kind of happened, but instead of like the government having all the cameras, it's everyone has cameras, and cell phones and stuff. And that's the difference that happened. And, and that's just like no one anticipated that. When they were writing 1984, they didn't anticipate that everyone is going to have a camera. They just thought there were just going to be surveillance everywhere and government surveillance everywhere, which there is, but it's kind of balanced out with the fact that everyone has a camera. Everyone has that capacity to take their own photo and document what's happening. So in fantasy, they use these elements, right? The story has to do with magic. The story has to do with knights. The story has to do with swords and maybe magical or mystical creatures, elves, things like that. And it's interesting because it doesn't matter what the creature is. It doesn't matter if it's an elf or a human or a hobbit or like whatever it is, or like an emperor of another, Melnibone, or another universe, or another like grand city or something like that is the main character of the story. It's always a person, the thing about the Hobbit is he's basically a person, The thing about like any hero in fantasy, they're basically people. Like the old hero myths were, about Hercules and all that stuff. He was a person, but he was like super person. He was like the first Superman. You know, he was a person, but he was a god. You know, he was half god, half person. So he had all this power, and the thing is that like that doesn't really make a good story. You know, the character has to have weaknesses. You know, because we have to relate with the character. We have to relate with what their story is, what their adventure is, what their life is, and you can't relate with someone that's just powerful. You know, they have to have some kind of weakness. You know, it doesn't matter like what it is, whether it's an Achilles heel or Superman has kryptonite, and they always have to have weakness. You know, Elric of Melniboné, he had weakness. He was just like naturally weak, and he needed his sword to give him power. A lot of different stories. You know, like you always need the character to have some kind of weakness, because you can only relate with the character if there's weakness in the character. Someone that's completely strong, you know, like sort of like superheroes, they're too strong and they always win. And it doesn't really, in my opinion, it doesn't really make a compelling story where where the main character like always wins. You know, because in a lot of these stories, the main character loses. A lot of these stories, the main character dies at the end. You know, there's like, and there's different characters and whatever. But it's basically our story. It's basically how would we be if we were in this world. It gives you the opportunity to change the world around into a world that's completely different than anything in our present day-to-day life. And that's the reason people read these stories. It's an escape from day-to-day life. They feel like they're part of that story. They feel like they are that hero or that anti-hero or whatever that's in that universe, and maybe they're not that person, but they're with that person. They're on that adventure, you know? And that's the feeling people want to get from any story, you know? But the thing is that with sci-fi and fantasy, you're on an adventure. You know, not just an adventure, but an adventure that you cannot take unless you were in that story, unless you were reading that book. Because anyone could be like, it's not the same adventure as modern fiction. Modern day fiction might be, you know, a story about somebody traveling to a far land, or a story about how someone is struggling with modern life and relationships, and they have a girlfriend, boyfriend, they have friends, they have to pay the rent, and they have to, you know, work a job, and, you know, they have hobbies, and they're into certain things, and they really want to do this with their life and whatever. And that's cool. And if that's written well, that's cool. But what fantasy does, it takes that to another world where you're not just relating with a character because they kind of have the same dealings you have, but you're relating, you're, and it's not even that you're just on this adventure. And that's, I think, the thing about sci-fi and fantasy. It's an otherworldly thing. It lets you go into another universe and have an adventure in that universe where you don't know what's going to happen next. You know, and whether it's sci-fi or whether it's fantasy. Sci-fi is just fantasy, but it's in the future. It's technology. It's what we think the future is going to be. You know, we think the future is going to be interplanetary travel, spaceships, but we don't know that for sure. You know, no one thought the future was going to be the internet, communication, cell phones. They thought about cell phones. They thought, well, in the future, we're going to have phones that we have with us that we can talk on. But no one thought that it's going to get to the next level and the next level and the next level, where it's basically these computers that we have in our pockets that do everything, right? And they kind of did that, but they didn't really think of it. It's going to be like one device that does everything. They thought it was going to be like different devices and stuff like that. But the internet, no one thought that there was going to be an internet. But it made sense. It makes sense that we're people who communicate with people. We like to talk to other people, and the internet is just the next level of communication. You know, instead of just talking to the person next to you or talking on the phone to one person, you're able to talk to a lot of people through a lot of, in a lot of, like, all over the planet, all over the world, in an instant and for free, basically. Well, you pay, your internet fee and your phone fee, But, if you want to talk to someone through Facebook Messenger, it's free. If it's not phone or text, it's free through a computer, through the internet, and anywhere in the world, anybody. And not only that, is like one person can talk to thousands and millions of people in one at the same time, and not a government person, not a person who's high up, not a king or a president or any of that, but a regular person, like a 10-year-old kid could, who has something to say, So that's that. But philosophy and I think it's more about there's definitely philosophy, and and philosophy is just like thinking about life. That's what that is, thinking about life. And what I think happens is when the author, he thinks about life and he uses that and he puts it into a metaphor and puts it in the story, in his fantasy story. Whatever's happening in his life, they basically translate it into what's happening with one of the characters or the main character. So if he's having trouble with somebody or whatever, the main character is basically fighting a demon or something like that, right? When he falls in love or finds a date or something like that, the main character falls in love or finds a romantic interest, and she's some kind of princess in a castle or whatever it is, right? So it's interesting because it's an immersive thing where, it's the philosophy of escapism, the philosophy of how do we enter another world and still stay in the world we're at. So old mythology, that's what it did. For example, people were people 40,000 years ago, or even not even 40,000 years ago. Think about the American Indian tribes, and they would just, what would they do? They would make stuff, they'd live in huts, they'd make a fire, they would sit around a fire, and they go hunting, and they go fishing, and they go picking vegetables or fruits or berries or something like that, right? So they had their food happening. That's how they got their food at the time. And so it was that day-to-day thing, right? Wasn't it? It was that day-to-day thing. And they were like, how do we have these imaginations, right? And our imaginations can take us to other places, And so they started creating stories. And these were fantasy stories about eagle-wing people, right? And people that came from the moon, or someone, or the moon talked to this person and told them where to find true love in the world, and then they went and they got married, and then and then he had kids, and then there was that, and then there was this whole adventure that they got on, and whatever it is, and how the moon talked to the sun and created rain or whatever it was, so it was yeah, we can talk and we can tell stories and we have an imagination, and this is I think we're different than any other animal because of that. I'm pretty sure that our level of that is more advanced than other animals can do. They just, not that it makes anything better, but it's just our level of it is the next level of it, and a language where we can tell stories that were obviously cannot be true, but at the same time feel true because it has human elements. It has elements in it of people's lives and what people think and what people believe and stuff like that. So it's not just taking a trip, taking a journey into another world. It's also, how would things happen in that world? How would, and if you just follow the main character, you would see it's a person. It's about a person in another world, and it's all, and the same thing with sci-fi. It's about the future, because when you go into the future, you're a person in another world. The world is only the same in the present and in the past. The future is unpredictable. Like no one, and you know, when you go into the future, you're a person in another world. The more you live and the more you go into the future, the more the world around you changes and the more you're in another world. So when you read a fantasy story, that's what it's about. The main character going on a quest, going on a trip for some reason, you know, to find a magic item or to save a land or to banish an evil ruler or wizard who's oppressing, you know, the people of a certain city or something like that. And how they do it, it's a map, it's a roadmap also. It's a roadmap of how, not like you can use the roadmap, it's just the roadmap of how this fictional character got, you know, found a problem and created a solution. And it's always in another world. It's always something different. But whenever you read these stories about these other worlds and these other beings, they're always metaphors. You know, they're always maybe not even intended to be metaphors, but sometimes they are. But they relate to us. They make us see. It makes us. You could see how our life is a reflection of the story or the fantasy world that they're in. Like, how would this world be? How would you react? What kind of adventures would you go on if you had that kind of a magic item or that kind of a magic weapon, or was surrounded by elves and magical beings and dwarves and all of, you know, and there was something that, you know, was important to banish an evil wizard who is going to destroy the land and fight monsters, you know. And it's interesting because people fight monsters in real life in a metaphorical way, right? And you know, and people like they have like sort of they have these relationships, and with, like, for example, like with an elf in a story, and that could be like a person's relationship with someone that's very, very different from who they are, and how people see, and all of these like elves and all of these characters have their own world and their own political system and their own like politics and their own like ways that they live, right? But and so like you kind of see their point of view, why they live that way, why they say what they're saying. It gives you, it sort of like stretches things out into another form. It's like, instead of being people, we're elves and we're all of these different beings and dwarves and hobbits and you know, and instead of just, you know, like having just being people, you know, you can kind of like, it's sort of like that childhood let's pretend, you know, it's a let's pretend to be knights, let's pretend to be wizards, you know, let's pretend to be like, let's pretend to be elves, or what it is, you know, let's pretend to go on a quest for a magical item, let's pretend that we're kings and princesses and princes of a land, right? And the same thing with sci-fi, where let's pretend we're in the future and we're on a spaceship and we're going to, and we're like, we're going throughout the whole galaxy just to see if there's anything out there. Like, is there life out there? Like, are there people on other planets? Different people, you know, who are different, maybe really different, but people still. And can we talk to them? And what are they like? You know, and can we actually be friends with them and not like get into a war with them or something dumb like that, right? But can we be friends with them? You know, who is out there? What is out there? We look out there and we see like space. You know, we don't see any other life at all like us at all. You know, so what's out there, right? And fantasy is like what's out there in our imagination. You know, where can our imagination take us? How realistic is this story going to make me feel? Is this story going to make me feel like I'm in another world, like I'm a knight or a wizard or some kind of hero that is saving the land, or the princess, or like, or the, you know, whatever, like the prince, and you know, and having these adventures with monsters and friends and magic weapons and magic items and, you know, magic ships and whatever, or magic horses and unicorns and stuff like that. You know, where can our imagination take us? And I think that's the philosophy of not just like for any story, but especially fantasy stories. It's the philosophy of, and the thing is that the more we see ourselves in the story and our lives in the story, the more our imagination takes to it and makes it feel really, really real. You know, where we relate with the story is where it feels real. And it's just a way for our imagination to enter another world, not really physically, but in your imagination, you can kind of enter another world and go on a journey and go on an adventure that otherwise you wouldn't be able to take. So this is my kind of like philosophy when I'm thinking with fantasy stories. I'll put a little science fiction in there. Yeah, let me know what you guys think. And yeah, like and subscribe to my channel, and I will see you in another video later.